The Wages of Dying by Meghan Purvis. Ruby Davis, a young bootlegger, isn't worried about the big city men muscling in on her boss's territory. That is, until they start biting necks. It's a big jump from ferrying liquor through Appalachia to hunting vampires through the nightclubs of Manhattan, with only an ex-showgirl and a gangland doctor for backup. But Ruby is out for revenge. Nothing can stop her. Or so she tells herself. But being so focused on her target puts her in danger of missing a threat closer to home. Penny ponders on the wages of dying. Yes, it's vampires, and no, it's not what you expect. The Wages of Dying by Meghan Purvis is a book of surprises. The author is an accomplished and award-winning writer, but this is her first novel. It's hugely well researched and engulfs you in the world of the story. But don't expect a standard vampire tale. As one reviewer noted, yes, it is a story involving vampires, but it's also about mobsters and booze traffickers and above all about people. Meghan Purvis herself took the road trip that her heroine Ruby Davis is forced to take, New York to New Orleans. Reading the book, it feels as though it must have been written by someone who was there, and I found myself working out her likely age on the assumption that she was a teenager in the 1920s. Turns out she'd be approaching her 120th birthday, which I deemed unlikely. Then I discovered she's considerably younger than I am. She's just an exceptionally good writer. And if I can quote again from that same review, it's written with the assurance, control and sheer skill of a much more experienced author, and the quality of language is impressive. The settings are vivid, the characterisations excellent, and the narrative pace brisk but perfectly regulated. A quarter of the way into the novel I was thinking, wow, this ought to sell, what a cracking piece of writing. In researching the story behind this story, all sorts of interesting snippets cropped up. One in particular was that Meghan originally intended to write a contemporary tale, but found herself struggling not to drown her opening chapters in backstory until it occurred to her that it was the backstory that was the real story, so that's the one she wrote. I was also intrigued by the road trip. I'm aware from interviews I've seen with Meghan that she has family connections that intersected with the route that her heroine took, which made it a special trip for a lot of different reasons. Here's what I asked Meghan. When you took your road trip, was it before or after you'd planned Ruby's? And are there any particular parts of those trips where the story met real life? And here's what Meghan replied. I did my research trip after I'd planned Ruby's. The Arts Council funded my proposal to help me flesh out those parts of the novel, and I'm so glad they did, as there are all kinds of details and ideas I only got by going there. New York, New Orleans, and London for that matter, where I now live, always seem like palimpsests to me, where layers of the city that was are crammed up against the city that is, and the construction of a city that will be. Being in both of those cities helped me get a feel for each place, but it also helped the overall story to experience how timeless they are. Seeing traces of the past integrated with the present makes you realise how briefly we're here when it comes down to it, and consequently how a potentially immortal being like a vampire would start to regard humans as a resource to be exploited. There are tons of small details from my trip that made it into the book, but my favourite is probably the little lizards that are all over New Orleans. I wandered around the Garden District a lot when I was there. It's an old neighbourhood with gorgeous houses, and I was actually outside a house Anne Rice owned for years, the first time I encountered them. You can't really write anything about vampires in New Orleans without acknowledging her influence. So while my writing and hers are very different, those lizards are a little tip of my hat to her, and I still look for them every time I visit. Well, wow. Doesn't that reinforce the impression that the whole book was meant to be? And was anyone else diving for the dictionary to double-check palimpsests? Or was it just me? I've not heard that word since the days an art history academic used sometimes to join us at lunch and hold us enthralled with stories of the world she was uncovering in her work. Palimpsests, a manuscript or piece of writing material on which later writing has been superimposed on effaced earlier writing. The Wages of Dying by Meghan Purvis. After a prologue set in 1862, this story leapfrogs to 1931. This is the prologue. 1862. Jedediah Thompson died in Virginia, though he wouldn't know it until weeks later. They'd been marching for days when the orders came to stop, assemble in wide lines, advance into the mist ahead of them. Cracks on a distant snare drum echoing like rifle shots. Wait for the commands to fire. Jed saw one boy aiming a wavering rifle high like a warning shot. That was the first time he thought he might not make it off that field. Seconds later, when the boy caught a bullet in the jaw and fell, his teeth shining like milk glass in the blood pulsing across his throat, Jed felt ice shimmer down his spine and knew the fear was true. The battle swirled, drums and horns came from every direction. A horse rushed out of the smoke while Jed was trying to reload. Its rider brandished a sabre, and Jed threw his arm up, and just as quickly the man and horse vanished. He'd recognised the colour of Jed's uniform just in time. Though he would go over the moment in his mind in years to come, Jed couldn't remember anything about the man who killed him, just a shadowy figure silhouetted against the fog. Jed took no chances. He aimed at the man's chest and fired. For a moment the figure was lit up as his own gun flashed. Jed could call up the memory, but try as he might, that light was all he could see. A momentary star out in the smoke, and then as the recoil of Jed's own shot jerked his shoulder back, another punch, at first so gentle Jed didn't know what it was. Then his knees gave. As Jed collapsed onto the ground, he was suddenly aware of the soft meat in his belly, so vulnerable, so easy to puncture. There was a patch of dark red blood on his stomach. It was small, but Jed had seen this kind of wound before and knew what it meant. He tried to drag himself backwards towards the safety of their camp. His legs kicked as hard as they could, but his strength ebbed away, and when he bumped into the body of another man, they would push him no further. The body next to him was William Everton's, and he wasn't dead yet. His forehead was a mess, and the collision, gentle as it was, snapped him back into consciousness. William started to scream. Jed didn't have the strength to yell himself, and for a moment he hoped William might summon rescue. But William was hysterical, chattering like a wounded animal, and anyone hearing him would hear it as the noise of a man not worth saving. No one would come. They lay there the rest of that day, as the air warmed and cooled around them. As William's voice faltered and turned into husky gurgles, and then as the sun sank down into the smoke and blood around them, the man came. The sky was growing dark above Jed, but in a moment it grew darker still. The bursts of retreating gunfire seemed worlds away, and through the smoke a figure, a slash of scarlet jacket appearing out of the woods, and Jed's first adult thought was that the angel of death was a redcoat. The man drew closer until he was next to Jed, looking down at the blood covering Jed's ruined stomach, black and sticky in the dark. He was a small man, solidly built, and the coat Jed had taken for a British Army jacket was no more than thick-boiled wool, an old-fashioned cut that Jed had not seen since he was a boy. Jed tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, his lips faltered. The man crouched and stuck a finger into Jed's belly. Jed let out a noise like a hissing cat, unable even to scream. The man pulled his finger back, bright blood streaking to the middle second knuckle, and dipped it delicately into his mouth. Jed saw the man's tongue come out, ruby against his pale face, and roll around his mouth. Then the man straightened, looked back down at Jed scrabbling weakly in the dirt, and spoke. "We all have a choice, you know, if it is offered to us." Jed stared up at him, this creature blotting out the sky, and nodded. The man bent again, and this time he put his teeth to Jed's neck and tore. His entire body was pain as he felt his neck opening. The world burst apart. The man finished drinking and stood, watching as Jed's blood flooded onto the ground. But as soon as the creature tore into him, as his own blood slipped down his throat, nearly choking him, Jed knew what to do. A hand pushed against the ground, faltered, then pushed again, turning him towards William. As Jed rolled, he could feel the cold grass of the field on his stomach, on the things inside his stomach, and then he was within reach. William stretched out his hand, even in his blank terror, trying to give and receive comfort. Jed grabbed William's wrist, brought it to his mouth and bit. The skin resisted, far more than any other meat Jed had tasted, and he had to grate his teeth against each other to find a vein. William's hand beat a weak tattoo against Jed's face, but within a minute or two it stopped. And then there was only Jed and the liquid in his mouth, in his throat, and the feel of his body pulling itself together. He opened his eyes, and the world was new. He could see it for the first time, every last part of it. The clump of soldiers still fighting in the dark, the medics at the camp, at both camps, his own and the Unionists at the far end of the field, the vultures in the trees waiting for morning to explore their feeding ground, the field mice hiding in their nests. Jed was a hawk casting his eye over the world, seeing everything and finding nothing that could frighten him. Not anymore. The man was waiting a few steps away. Jed followed him into the woods, and it was a long time before either spoke. From there they would head north, feeding off whoever they found, and there were so many to find. Soldiers sleeping hard at the edges of their camps, civilians fleeing battle marchers who left their towns and never returned, orphans on the road who would never be missed. Jed died, and when he lived again, it was as something like a man, a thing that walked and spoke like one, something that aped mankind's pretty manners and sometimes chose to sit at its table. But death can't be shaken off once it comes. Jed brought it out of Virginia with him, carried it across endless miles and years. Jed welcomed death and held it close. He let it loose upon the world.
Ah, well, hello, Meghan. Very nice to see you. Okay.
Hello, Mark.
And now you've written a vampire story, which FBP have accepted. I have to confess, I have not yet read all of it, but when I looked at the beginning, I thought, this is someone who knows how to introduce a horror story. May I ask, what got you into writing horror fiction?
Yeah, avoiding other work, really, procrastinating. I was working on a thesis at the time, which was a translation of Beowulf, which has, I think, its own horror elements in and of itself.
Yes.
With arms getting ripped off and swords flashing around. But I was in the toughest part of the dissertation, which I always say, when you're in that stretch of writing, your house will be the cleanest it will ever be. You will cook the most gourmet meals of your life, just absolutely anything. And so in my casting around for something else to do, I thought, I know, I'll write a novel. And so that was where it started. Yeah. Out of avoiding writing about translation theory.
I love that, yes. And you're right, of course, Beowulf is such a horror story itself. It really gives you a great start, doesn't it?
Yeah, there are certainly some atmospheric moments when Beowulf and they're in the hall waiting for Grendel to attack the first time. I don't think I lifted too outrageously, but I definitely was aiming for that level of tension.
Yeah, well, I think you've got a fair bit of tension in there, which is great. Yeah. After all, it doesn't matter what genre of novel you're writing, unless you have some tension and some conflict, it isn't a story.
Yeah, yeah.
It's essential, isn't it?
Yes.
It's lovely that you got into it that way. Did you actually finish the thesis?
I did finish the thesis.
Good.
I get the doctor honorific in front of my name, which
Splendid.
I use for bank applications and not on planes or in theaters. But then your background, it sounds like you also have the honorific, but perhaps in a more diligent field than me, I'll say.
Well, yes, I was in medical practice until I saw the light, and then I got into medical research and picked up a PhD on the way there, and then took early retirement and spent a little while teaching in a men's prison part-time,
Wow.
which was different, and has been a great inspiration for some of my fiction.
Yeah.
Oh boy, some of the stories from there. Wow.
I'd say I can imagine, but I don't think I can.
Well, yes, yes. Perhaps you can't. Perhaps you will. Okay. But yes, so I do have that sort of qualification as well. I don't know whether that's any great use when it comes to fiction writing, but it's nice to have it. It's certainly very useful for dealing with certain types of officials.
Yes, very much so.
Okay. Yes, I'm sure you will find that. You had some mentoring, I believe, didn't you, when you got into
I did. I was on the Escalator program, which was put on, I think it's called the Norwich Writing Center, but now it's changed its name. But I lived in Norwich for about 5 years. I did postgrad work at UEA, and there was a program put on that each year had a theme, and the year that I was working on my novel or had started work on it, their theme was horror writing. So there were, I think, about a dozen of us who were paired up with a mentor to work with on our manuscript. And I worked with Kathy Unsworth, who is a fantastic writer, and a fantastic mentor, in part because she paid no attention whatsoever to the direction she was given. She was told, your job is to help them finish a manuscript, to strengthen the story. We will handle, doing a reading at the end, inviting agents. You do not need to introduce them to your agent. Don't do any of that. And she immediately introduced me to her agent.
Right.
and we went from there. So I bumbled my way into being extremely lucky, I think, both in mentor and in agent.
Oh, that's splendid. What a lovely story. And a very good outcome. You now have a novel on the way there.
Exactly, yes.
Well, that's really good. Yes. Well, for myself, I don't write horror fiction really. Curiously enough, the first fiction work I had published, which was in Canada, is called 13 Strange Tales. It's,
that sounds pretty horror-ish, I must say.
Well, there are nothing explicit. There are no real ghosts in it. There are no real monsters in it. It's just that disturbing things happen to people, sometimes fatally. But nobody quite understands why. So that's the sort of stories I wrote for that. One explicit bit of horror, I suppose, I ever wrote. When I wrote the first novel that FBP published for me was National Cake Day in Ruritania. And I, among other things, I deliberately mixed every possible genre in there. So it had to have a little bit of horror fiction element in it, which was a weirmidge.
I'm sorry.
A were-midge. It was a, instead of a werewolf, this guy turns into a midge, a very large one.
I actually, having had a friend who lived in northern Scotland, I feel like
say no
a
more.
weremidge is genuinely terrifying.
Oh yes, oh they are. The saber-toothed midge of Glentorridon, you know, is a well-known phenomenon. Yes, it's terrible things. But when we got the FBP's Horror Story Challenge at Short Horror Fiction, and they showed this marvelous picture of this winter scene, mountain range, chalets, snow-covered slope, conifers, large building, the hotel come castle or something, frozen lake. Write a story about it.
Exactly.
Yeah, what fun. So I got my creative writing group in Chapel and the Frith, which is a town about half an hour's drive from where I live. And I teach this group. I said, look, horror competition, let's go for it. And they weren't at all sure, but I persuaded some of them by saying, well, if you have a go, I'll have a go. And sure enough, I ended up, I can't remember whether it was 5 or 6 stories that we put together collectively and in there. And lo and behold, out of the collection of 25 in the anthology, 3 are from our group, which is rather lovely.
That's an excellent acceptance rate.
Oh yes, I mean, yes, I'll buy that one. And I was very, very pleased that one, she's a woman in her, I'm not quite sure her age, 60-ish. And she's had a go at writing one novel, which is self-published, and she wants to write another one, but doesn't really have very much confidence in herself as a writer. But she had to go at it, and she won the 2nd prize in the competition.
Oh, amazing! Now I have to ask, who won first?
Oh, yeah, well, they gave it to me, which was slightly embarrassed me, to be honest. But well, it's a great honour, and
well deserved, I'm sure.
well, they seem to like it, but apparently the judge got his wife to read it, and she said, yeah, that's completely messed up. Which was a lovely compliment.
Exactly. I think that's always the reaction you're going for. Who hurt you that you wrote this?
Oh, it's a good question. I'm not sure. Maybe it is an influence somewhere from my folktale collecting, because some of our folktales are pretty weird.
Yes. I actually have something that I keep toying with that's based on black shuck out of East Anglia.
Oh, black shuck we get everywhere.
Yes, that's the impression that I've got. Because yeah, where you're a ways off from East Anglia, aren't you?
Oh, fair distance, yes. So it's quite a long drive. But yes, it's North Derbyshire, which is somewhere between the Midlands and the north of England, you would say. But not very far from where I live is Shuck Wood.
Are you joking?
No, I'm not joking at all. And we have 2 or 3 of our traditional folk tales that involve the black dog.
Amazing.
As a warning of something terrible would happen.
Yeah.
So so yes, this is universal.
It's waiting for all of us. Just
waiting for all of us. So with this sort of folklore background, I suppose it's bound to influence it in a way, indirectly.
I think so. I think there is something. I always feel like the first stories around a campfire must have been about something out there in the dark, and I think I think to an extent, if you're interested in stories and going back and looking at old stories, you end up there without fail.
I think you do, and going back into some of the old stories it's an inexhaustible well of inspiration if you want to write creepy and horrific things.
Yes.
Or crazy things, because I'm sure you're right. And a lot of Homer's great epics. I mean, that was composed by men sitting around a campfire telling lies, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes, about the biggest, scariest thing they ever saw. And
That's right, yes.
yeah, if you go back and look at any kind of stories like that, even fairy tales, once you get back to the roots, they're often genuinely horrifying and not at all like the Disney versions.
Well, I mean, did you ever find a horror story more horrific than Hansel and Gretel?
I know, yes. Or something more poignant and just sort of heartbreaking than The Little Mermaid. That one always.
Exactly, yes. I mean, it just, you in tears reading that, aren't you?
Yes.
Oh, Meghan, what a lovely chat. Thank you very much for talking. And
thank you so much for having me.
Not at all. It's my pleasure.
Melody muses on vampires. They're not the only ones with sharp teeth. The Wages of Dying by Meghan Purvis is a vampire book. But I didn't know that when I started it. Not that there weren't some massive signposts from page 1 onward, but I was wrapped up enough in the story and the lives of the characters that I missed them. And like the best books in any genre, or indeed any competent vampire, it got its teeth into me and didn't let go. I was soon rooting for the flawed but determined Ruby Davis, whose life was being turned upside down. It wasn't easy for a young woman in Ruby's position in either New Orleans or New York in the early 20th century in Prohibition America. The evocation of both time and place was so powerful, I was left with the impression of having read the book by gaslight. I wasn't alone in this view. One reviewer said, "Highly entertaining, fast-paced story that is written so beautifully that at times it feels like really good poetry." If Melody was to ask a question about a vampire book, which of course she was, teeth had to come into it, and anyway there was a dog. It was one of those asides that she simply had to know about. Here's what she said to Meghan Purvis. When a stranger smiles at your heroine Ruby, it reminds her of a dog that once snapped at her, but before it did so, it has smiled, all teeth and eyes. Where was she when that happened? Was it a dog she knew? Why did it snap? Here's what Meghan said. I love this question. I'm very much a dog person and an animal person in general. This was a dog in Ruby's neighbourhood when she was growing up in Pennsylvania, but not one she or her family owned. I think it snapped because she surprised it. Ruby was always exploring and getting into things as a child, and if she crashed down from a tree or through a hedge in front of a dog, it might have felt like it needed to protect itself and warn her off. I like to think the adult Ruby would know better, both to be careful around a dog you're only on a nodding acquaintance with, and not to give any dog a reason to snap at you. That answer confirmed a conclusion that I hadn't realised I'd reached, that Ruby was the sort who would have been an exploring and getting into things child, even a tree climber. We only see her as an adult in pretty stressful circumstances, with or without the vampires present, but it shows how well she comes off the page as a real person. And don't you just love that description of the dog that smiled, all teeth and eyes? Some of the reviews I read noted with surprise that this was Meghan Purvis's debut novel, and remarked on how assured and unlike a first novel it seemed. Indeed, it is a debut novel, but Meghan Purvis is an accomplished writer who's won a prestigious award for literary translation. One thing's for sure, Meghan knows her way around words and vampires.
This is the Talk Radio Europe Book Show with Hannah Murray.
Joining us on the line now is Meghan Purvis, who has won the Stephen Spender Prize for Literary Translation for her translation of Beowulf. She is with us on the book show to talk about her debut novel. She was awarded an Arts Council grant to help her research the book. It's called The Wages of Dying, and it's set between New York and New Orleans in 1920s America. It's officially launched on National Vampire Awareness this day, which is October the 30th. Welcome to the show, Meghan.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us. So tell us a little bit about your connection with vampires then, and why you wanted to write a book involving vampires.
It's funny. I've not always been a vampire fan. I mean, I like horror books. I like watching horror movies. But I think really I'm probably more of a werewolf girl. But vampires, there's just something interesting about them and the way they move through history. I think that was the bit that kind of got me going. The idea of, what if someone with morals or lack of morals in a way very different to our own was still around, and kind of what would they care about? What would they do? And so that was the jumping off point.
And how about the setting, 1920s America between New York and New Orleans? You hadn't been to New Orleans before, had you?
No, I hadn't. It's one of those places that always, there's such a mythology about it that I've always been curious. And then when I started writing it, I've always liked history. I read a lot of Golden Age detective novels. So, between the world wars, really. And so that was something I'd always really loved. And so when I was writing the book, originally it was close to New York. It starts on the East Coast and it ends up in New York pretty quickly. But then after that, I needed to shift locations. It needed to fit a couple of different wrinkles for the plot, and New Orleans was just calling to me, so I went for it. Being able to visit definitely helped. There was one scene in particular where people are running through a forest, and after I'd actually been to New Orleans, I realized the trees are all wrong. I've written a Scandinavian forest in the middle of swampland. I think I need to fix this.
How funny. That makes a difference, doesn't it? Because it's good that you went there and saw that, because people from New Orleans would read the book and go, no, that's not right.
Yes, I'm living in terror a bit because I have relatives in New Orleans as well. And if I screw the details up, they will let me know.
Oh, so in terms of the plot, did you have a clear idea of the characters first, or the story, would you say?
I would say the story. It started in a completely unrelated way. I was working in a library at the time that one corner of it had a problem with fleas. And so whenever we had to reshelve books in that area, we were all going, oh God, tuck your socks outside your trousers and try and, because you would sometimes get home and find a flea on you. And that happened to me. I realized I was being bitten sitting on my couch at home and killed it, and then was sitting there going, oh, if only we were like ladybirds. They taste bad, so birds don't eat them. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be handy if I tasted bad so fleas didn't want to bite me? And then from there, I was like, hang on a second. And so it all kind of came out of that, going, what would it look like if someone was poisonous to vampires?
Interesting. So tell us about some of the main characters in the book.
Sure. So my protagonist, although there are a couple of main characters, is Ruby Davis, who is a young woman living in a small town in Appalachia. She is a bootlegger, so she helps run alcohol that's being brewed in stills up in the mountains back into town where it's sold there or passed on. And she has a fairly small town life and is fine with that until shenanigans ensue and kind of the bigger world is forced upon her. She later runs into a young man named Jack, who is a doctor, an unqualified doctor. He did medical training but never finished school for a mob boss in New York City. And he's been sent out with a couple of friends to investigate some strange happenings to try to figure out what's happening with a power grab. And they run into each other. So the two of them are the focus. They've got a couple of friends in tow. And then the big baddie is is a vampire named Jed, who has existed since just before the Civil War. That's where he died originally. And he has since moved up the ranks within vampires. He has an alcohol mini empire in the States that he's very eager to hang on to. And Ruby and some other unnamed characters are screwing up his plans.
Mm-hmm. So were you quite clear with that when you first thought of this story? Did you have a clear idea of what you wanted to happen and how it would end? Or did a lot of that come when you started writing the book?
Yeah, I've heard that, excuse me, I've heard that you're either a planner or a pantser, and you fly by the seat of your pants when you're writing. I'm much more of a planner. I had a beginning very early on. I had a vision of what I wanted for the end of the story. And so it was a question of filling in the middle a bit. That did change over the course of writing it. Just as you keep going, you realize what works and what doesn't. The characters flesh themselves out. And you realize, actually, this choice I want to have them make isn't going to work. That isn't who this person is. So things get tweaked. But I would say I had a rough outline that I stuck to most of the time.
And were you kind of surprised that you ended up writing this kind of book, or do you think it's been like years in the making and you always knew that this was the kind of book you were going to write?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not surprised that I wrote something with a historical setting, because that is something that I love. The paranormal aspect of it, it wasn't something that I was planning to write about. It just kind of happened. But I think the larger issues in the book, I think a lot of it is about female anger. And that's something that goes back to Beowulf. I think my translation of it is very interested in women's experiences in a world where might makes right, in a world of violence. And I think that's very similar in The Wages of Dying as well. I'm interested in how Ruby is making her way in this world and how she responds when the stakes get higher, as they inevitably do.
And tell us a bit about the title, The Wages of Dying.
That's a great question, and no one has asked me that before. It is actually a quotation from a 1970s poem that Galway Kinnell wrote about his infant daughter. He's watching her sleep and thinking about the passage of time and how that inevitably means loss. And the last line of the poem, or the last couple of lines, includes the phrase, "The wages of dying is love." And that line stuck with me, I think, because, especially as a kid, I was a very goth little child. I thought about death a lot. And as a kid, when I first learned about vampires, I thought, well, that would be great. You live forever. You can learn every language you've ever wanted to. You can read every book you've ever wanted to. And so I think for me, The Wages of Dying, the trade-off is the connections that we have as the living. It means loss, but it also means love. And that's the bargain. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at in the book as well.
So have you already thought about your next book?
Yes. It'd be fantastic if people wanted to keep reading about what Ruby and her friends get up to. I am chomping at the bit to do more if they'll have me. The other thing I'm working on right now, it's another historical thing. It's an alternate universe, alternate history where World War I didn't end. And it's set in Europe and London. So I'm on this side of the pond this time around.
Wow, what an interesting concept. Where did you get that thought from?
I think it was, because there have been so many kind of memorial activities and remembrances over the last few years about World War I. And then at the same time, we have these conflicts, going on in the Middle East, especially America's approach. I won't swing too political, but certain approaches to foreign policy or violent foreign policy in other places. And it just kind of makes you think, is this the forever war? Is this the one that's never going to end? And what would have happened if that had started with what is really the first modern war. So it's playing with that.
Interesting. Love it. Well, if people want to get a copy of your novel that we've been talking about, it's called The Wages of Dying, and it's published to coincide with National Vampire Awareness Day, which is October the 30th. It's available on our website, tre.radio. Meghan Purvis, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much.
The Book Programme, presented by Hannah Murray.